Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new session with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. Today, we do have Ernest Johansson, mental health expert, to talk to us about the difference between men and women mental health. Ernest, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. And once again, it's always an honor to be here. Speaking and advocating for mental health and mental wellness is very, very important to me and my work. And I think it's valuable for everyone to have access to mental health care and be aware of mental health challenges that many of us face.
Thank you, sir. So, what you can tell us about the difference between men and women mental health?
Well, the short answer is women are much more likely to seek help. Um, and while the statistics on suicide intervention are about 50-50, more or less, in terms of professional interventions with suicidality. 75% of deaths via suicide are men. And in part, that is because men are far less apt to reach out for help in those crucial moments when when engaging in acute suicidal ideation and behaviors to end your life via suicide. Men are far less likely to reach out. Um, Under the age of 50, suicide is the second leading cause of death for men. And then additionally, the highest suicide rates for any aged and gendered demographic in Canada are men over the age of 80 and men the ages, we're going to go a little young here, ages 15 to 28. Those are the two most likely demographics to end their life via suicide. Um, 1.6 million men in Canada have, in the statistics I have date back to 2023, 1.6 million have contemplated suicide in their lifetime, men over the age of 15. And while men are roughly 1 in 10 experience symptoms of or rather have diagnoses of either a combination, either or both, of anxiety and or depression. 1 in 10 have that, but of those 1 in 10, only 20% actively seek help. And so that lends itself to a situation in which men are far less likely, or rather are far less likely to have appropriate tools to address their mental health. And one statistic that I believe is reflective of this is that men are also much more likely to engage in problem drinking or have alcoholism than women. Now, I don't want to get too far down this topic without kind of addressing a potential elephant in the room. Patriarchy, sexism, those social forces disadvantage everyone except for cisgendered heterosexual men. So I don't want any of this to be misconstrued as sort of a woe is me about the state of being a man, or to infer that women somehow have it easier, because the wider body of data would say the exact opposite. Rather, the way men are socialized to be men, they are much more likely to internalize mental health challenges, not seek out and not seek help, and not engage in pro-adaptive coping behaviors, but rather engage in maladaptive coping, such as alcoholism, such as aggressive behavior, and many other things. And patriarchy disadvantaging everyone but cisgendered men. Um, Often there is this manifest in society today called the manosphere, which is largely social media. It's always been around to an extent, but pros and cons of the internet. Kind of fringy viewpoints are often have more of a critical mass or are more accessible. And this entity, the manosphere, or kind of male gurus, will often promote solutions for men that rely heavily on the mistreatment of women and misogyny, will rely heavily on narratives of earning a tremendous amount of wealth above all costs without ethics. A lot of physical fitness narratives, and physical fitness in and of itself is obviously a very good thing for mental health, but the way it's talked about in the manosphere is a way that is relatively unhealthy. And lots of violence and conquest narratives. And these narratives all include a high degree of misogyny. These narratives are often engaged with by younger men who maybe don't have good relationships in their lives and are quite socially harmful. Without going down a rabbit hole, there are lots of social ills and actual episodes of violence which can be traced to um, young men engaging with the manosphere without going down that rabbit hole. So, what I hope to do for the rest of our talk here is to kind of explain whether, some of the history of these narratives of manhood are that disadvantage men in the sense that they're less likely to reach out. Now, this is a talk I've given many times, or a variant of a talk that I've given many times in my professional life in addressing crowds of young men. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to adjust it in the relatively near future because um, I do make pop culture references sometimes when I do public speaking, and those references are now dated. Because what I usually do is I bring up kind of the what I would have called my grandfather's favorite man. And it's a little bit of a straw man, but it does fit males that would have been my grandfather's age. And I'm speaking of John Wayne. Now, John Wayne was an actor, a renowned Hollywood actor who kind of played very extra manly men, quote unquote, alpha tough guys in lots of what would be called spaghetti westerns and war movies and various movies about what was deemed a man in Western standards. And world famous, basically wealthy, famous, honored in that context. And he was often presented in a lot of social narratives as the ideal man for men. And what values did his roles manifest? Well, there's conquest, and it's nobilized, it's honored. Um, a lot of the tropes he would have played to would have been celebratory tropes about the colonization of the Americas by European colonists and settlers vis-a-vis American Indians and indigenous people on what is Turtle Island, the Americas. Another trope would have been what I have called kind of a spit tobacco juice on your owies mentality about physical wounds and implicitly and at times explicitly emotional wounds. Being told to man up when you're sad, being told to man up when there's an emotional conflict. And a lot of his roles manifest in kind of a celebration of that, if not it explicitly stated, at least implicitly. And then there's sexism, which in his roles, the male figure kind of is often treating women like objects and as disposable and as beings who are valued only insofar as they please their man or a man or the man. And also there's a lot of, and this goes hand in hand with misogyny, there's a lot of implicit and explicit racism in terms of his roles. Now, what does this all add up to? This is a very Western image of manhood that is kind of the archetype that American and to a hugely large extent Canadian males have for generations been lauded to be. And what we're left with is a narrative in which emotional vulnerability is seen as weakness. And that is ultimately very, very harmful because these things sit and fester. And John Wayne himself represented kind of a performative, prepackaged narrative of manhood. You are an army general, you are a cowboy, you are a whiskey drinking gunslinger. And there's not room for emotional vulnerability. But John Wayne himself, the man, didn't actually live up to the performative narrative of his roles. It and honestly, it's very telling that he, for instance, he had troubles with alcoholism and never really, as far as I know, sought tangible help. And I would argue that is a manifest of not having the tools, the space, or the mechanisms to address mental health concerns. Additionally, he avoided military service. He actually got a medical discharge when he was eligible to fight in. I'm sorry, I'm dated here. I'm not going to be able to cite the conflict he was supposed to fight in, but he sought a medical discharge, and it was kind of seemed that he was avoiding military service. So it wasn't, in fact, the sheriff, the cowboy, the soldier, the general that he was purported to be, but rather performatively so, which really fits these narratives of manhood. And additionally, most telling, I believe in the 1970s Oscars, Marlon Brando yielded his space after he won to an indigenous woman named Sachin Littlefeather, who spoke on the challenges that indigenous Americans were facing in the context of the wider American Indian movement, which was popular at the time or emerging at the time. It still very much exists. And she challenged those in the crowd to live in a way that was honoring of the treaty agreements that existed between the U.S. federal government and indigenous people, as well as be aware of the marginalization of indigenous people. And John Wayne was there. He was in the crowd. And his response to this was to want to fight this young petite woman who spoke out. And he was so threatened. His narratives of self were so threatened by an indigenous woman speaking in a way that was contrary to a sense of patriotism and sense of self that he literally wanted to fight her and had to be restrained. Um, so what does all of this tie into in terms of men's mental health? The short answer is this is a facade. These narratives of manhood, while they're presented as something that has existed in perpetuity, has has always been there, are in fact quite that's quite not true. There are many historical examples all over the world of honored and acknowledged different manifests of manhood in various societies that did not allow for men to just be pigeonholed in one role, an emotionally unfeeling, unexpressive being. And a concept that it pops up often in these discussions is the Wintake of the Dakota peoples, many people, indigenous people in the kind of northern Midwest of the United States, bordering on Canada. The concept of a Wintake, who was someone who is physiologically male in the sense we view it, sex male, but had a different presentation, a more gentle presentation, and they were emotionally expressive. They had different traditional roles in society, and there are other examples across the world. I think of Sami people in Norway, where um, a lot of the traditional culture centers around reindeer herding, and there's a lot of physical labor involving following the herd. But men who are not inclined for that role held a just as honored position of being what's called a noidai, which is a spiritual healer plus medicine man, so a physical healer as well, a caretaker. And so the point is, it hasn't always been historically that men were these tough, unfeeling beings. And so, how does that tie in today? Well, we have to, as men, be able to reach out for help. And we have to, even with a degree of anonymity, reach out for people where we can talk about mental health and know that emotions aside from anger or aggression are okay to have. And even still today, so many men do not have that, which is reflected in these suicide rates, which is reflected in rates of alcoholism, was reflected even in people who are diagnosed with anxiety and depression, not reaching out for help consistently. And so my message is, in short, is that while these prefabricated constructs of manhood might deem it um, a betrayal of being a man, or might deem it a failing of toughness to reach out for help. I would argue the opposite. I think it takes far more courage to reach out for help and be in tune about emotions that maybe an individual may not be able to handle than it does to kind of blanket oneself in a largely unattainable, unrealistic narrative of what it is to be a man and not reach out for help. And instead go for maladaptive coping mechanisms such as alcoholism. And no judgment if someone's experiencing alcoholism, they need to reach out for help too when they're ready. But reaching out for maladaptive coping or falling back into patterns of misogyny, colonial narratives, racist narratives, but rather have the strength to be vulnerable and know that vulnerability is strength. So, I mean, that's a time that's kind of a little parametered, shortened version of a talk I give widely. But the final message is basically it's okay to have adverse feelings. What's not okay is to address them in ways that hurt yourself or others, communities, those around you, and ultimately yourself. And recognize that constructs of manhood that may have been normalized are relatively limited. And it's historically inaccurate to say that um, those are the only ways people have always viewed manhood. It's simply not true. And reach out for help. That's really the bottom line.
Thank you so much, Ernest. And of course, we all will need some help at certain point of our life. So we do encourage everyone who might need that help or support to reach out to, well, there's a lot of resources that could help prevent things from developing, that could help changing paths, that could help really to bring people better life and more happiness.
And I might add, I say this resource because it's very widely available, but calling 988, it's a national resource, separate entities, but the same concept in both the US and Canada. 24/7, no questions asked. You can talk to a mental health professional. You can start there. They can refer you to local resources wherever you might be, but you can start there. Um,
988.
yes, call 988 or you can text, call, and I believe there's a web chat option as well if you were to Google that. But call 988. It's free from any phone. The phone doesn't even have to have service. Um, and start from there.
Thank you so much, Ernest, for this fruitful presentation as always. And for everyone, thank you for being here with us today. Stay well, stay safe, and we are looking forward to see you at another session with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative.